Just getting it to the surface of Mars was difficult enough, yet the Curiosity rover continues to change our understanding of the red planet.
Okay, I'm out.
Okay, he's out. He's close free.
Okay, I put a little roll in, took it right out.
Gemini was NASA's hastily conceived bridging program, designed to perfect techniques needed for a lunar landing. Gemini 4 saw astronaut Ed White leave his capsule and walk in space, but the spacecraft's attempt to rendezvous with its booster had been a failure. Gemini 5 had set an American endurance record of close to 8 days, but its rendezvous exercise had failed as well. On the morning of October the 25th, 1965, 2 rockets stood awaiting launch at Cape Canaveral. While astronauts Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford prepared for blastoff on Gemini 6, a special Atlas Agena target vehicle stood waiting on Pad 14. Because rendezvous and docking was integral to its moon landing strategy, NASA had commissioned the Agena docking module. It would be carried to orbit atop an Atlas booster. As the Gemini 6 crew were being strapped in, the Atlas-Agena combination was entering the final minutes of its countdown. The plan was for Gemini 6 to rendezvous and dock with the Agena 4 times in a flight that was expected to last 2 days. Gemini 6 was scheduled to launch around 90 minutes after the Agena, with the countdowns being tightly synchronized. The target vehicle lifted off as planned. This was the first Agena flight as part of the Gemini program, but the Atlas booster had served well during the Mercury program, and the Air Force had had success with the Agena upper stage, so no problems were expected. Gemini 6 waited as the target vehicle accelerated after a perfect launch. But minutes later, as the upper stage separated, all telemetry was lost and tracking radar detected 5 separate pieces. The Gemini mission was now pointless, and the launch was cancelled with Schirra and Stafford leaving their spacecraft. There was debate about what to do next. Scheduling for the Gemini program had been tight, with roughly 1 new launch every 6 weeks. There was no replacement Agena ready to launch before the next flight, Gemini 7. On the morning of December the 4th, 1965, astronauts Jim Lovell and Frank Borman were breakfasting before the launch of their Gemini 7 spacecraft. Among the others dining with them were the Gemini 6 crew, who would launch 9 days later. Gemini 7 was to be the longest duration flight yet, and for comfort during almost 14 days in orbit, the crew were wearing new lightweight spacesuits. NASA's doctors were worried about the effect prolonged exposure to weightlessness would have on astronauts, particularly the observed loss of red blood cells.
3, 2, 1.
Gemini 7 was designed to answer medical questions. It launched on schedule, before Gemini 6, which had been renamed Gemini 6A.
We're on our way, Frank.
It had taken NASA more than 60 days to prepare for a new launch. Now crews had 8 days till the launch of Gemini 6A, and they swung into action immediately. As soon as they reached orbit, the Gemini 7 crew turned their craft and began tracking with its upper stage. Gemini 4 attempted this, but had failed due to an insufficient knowledge of orbital mechanics. On December the 12th, Schirra and Stafford again prepared for launch. If all went well, within 6 hours of blastoff, they would be orbiting alongside Gemini 7. The launch pad crew had done an excellent job readying the booster in record time, and the countdown continued smoothly.
2, 1. Ignition. Shutdown, Gemini 6.
But then shut down. The engines had started, and after 1 second, they stopped.
Oxidizer pressure is down to about 32.
The Commander Schirra had the option of pulling the D-ring and ejecting both of them from the capsule, but he sat tight.
Just sitting here breathing.
Nobody knew what had gone wrong. For a second time, the crew of Gemini 6 had failed to launch. A connector had come away before the booster had lifted off, and the onboard computer closed everything down. This was rectified, along with another glitch in a turbo pump. 3 days later, they were ready to try again.
Go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The flight plan called for the rendezvous to happen on Gemini 6's 4th orbit, and Schirra made the first orbital correction 94 minutes into the flight. Gemini 7 would remain passive, with all orbital adjustments being made by Gemini 6. After 3 hours, slightly more than 400 kilometres separated the two craft, and Gemini 7 was picked up by Schirra and Stafford on radar. After 5 hours, Gemini 7 appeared as a bright dot, and soon after, the two spacecraft were flying in formation.
6 and 7 away. We'll be standing by if you have anything for us.
Okay.
3 years earlier, in 1962, the Russians had launched Vostoks 3 and 4 so that they could pass close to each other, and it had seemed like another Soviet triumph. With the rendezvous of Gemini 6 and 7, the Americans realised that the Vostoks had accomplished 2 well-timed launches, a very different achievement to the precision on-orbit changes they had accomplished. For more than 4 hours, the two spacecraft flew side by side, sometimes coming as close as 30 centimetres. It gave NASA confidence in its rendezvous technique, but there had not been a docking as had originally been intended when the target had been the Ejection. After slightly more than a day in orbit, Gemini 6 re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and was picked up in the Atlantic Ocean. Gemini 7 continued on in orbit for 2 more record-breaking days, with Borman and Lovell reading books to pass the time. They returned to Earth on December the 18th and were picked up by the Wasp, the same ship that had recovered the Gemini 6 crew. It was at this point that NASA started to believe the American space program was gaining greater expertise than their Soviet adversaries. However, the elusive docking exercise had still not taken place, and nobody realised just how difficult this would be. When the Cassini probe reached Saturn, staff at the JPL Operations Centre watched eagerly for confirmation that it had carried out its orbital insertion instructions. It arrived in July 2004 after a journey lasting almost 7 years, and it had to perform a precisely aligned 95-minute burn to enter a highly eccentric orbit. Because of the great distances involved, the craft has to perform autonomously. Instructions to Cassini are sent a long time in advance via the Deep Space Network. Signals confirming that it had gone into orbit took 85 minutes to reach Earth. After 6 months orbiting Saturn, Cassini approached Titan, Saturn's biggest moon. By this stage, it had already flown past Titan several times, capturing radar and photographic images. This time, it released a lander, the Huygens probe. Titan is so large, it holds a thick atmosphere, so Huygens was equipped with a heat shield and a parachute. As it was floating down towards the surface, the lander began taking photographs and analysing the atmosphere's constituent gases. It made the first soft landing in the outer solar system, and although it performed well, relaying data back to Cassini, only one of the orbiter's recorders was on. Half of the images were lost. We now know that Titan has lakes on its surface, lakes of liquid methane. The Cassini probe has been active for more than 10 years, and during that time, it's helped us learn about the strange behaviour of Saturn. At first, it seemed that the northern and southern hemispheres of the gas giant were rotating at different rates, but it now appears that the wind speeds in the south are faster. Cassini's looping orbit is regularly modified so that it can pass close by features that mission specialists want to study. Another Saturnian moon, Enceladus, surprised observers. It is 1/10 the size of Titan, yet it appears to hold a thin atmosphere of water vapour. Observations suggest this atmosphere is being replenished by cold water volcanoes near the South Pole. Cassini is equipped with a mass spectrometer, and it was able to detect salt, water, and various hydrocarbons. It is now thought that a salty ocean lies beneath Enceladus's icy crust. Some planetary physicists believe Saturn's inner E-ring receives its particles from Enceladus. In 2008, Cassini was renamed the Equinox mission, and recently it received another extension and became the Cassini Solstice mission. It takes Saturn roughly 30 Earth years to orbit the Sun, and, like the Earth, its axis is tilted, so it has seasons. When Cassini arrived, the planet's north pole was in shadow, and it was only recently that the probe could capture images of the peculiar hexagonal polar vortex. This hexagonal pattern was first observed in the 1980s by the Voyager mission. As spring in Saturn's northern hemisphere progressed, 2 giant storms were seen developing. They showed us hot spots in the infrared part of the spectrum, with both travelling towards the west. The larger storm moved faster, eventually engulfing the smaller one. Even after disturbances in the cloud patterns had dissipated, the storm still registered in the infrared. The rings orbit over Saturn's equator, extending from 6,000 to 120,000 kilometres above the surface, yet they are only 20 metres thick. They're made of ice, with particle sizes ranging from fine dust to 10-metre chunks. There are clumps within the rings that have changed since the Voyager's visits in the early 80s, with the inner F ring seeming to vary over a period of weeks. Saturn has at least 150 moons, and moonlets within the rings are thought to disturb the particles. Toward the end of its mission, with fuel running low, the risky trajectory will begin. Cassini will pass between the planet and its innermost ring, where the chance of collision with orbiting debris is extreme. It will sample the upper atmosphere and learn about the mass of the rings. To avoid possible contamination of the fragile moons, Cassini will ultimately be crashed into Saturn. In 2005, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter was headed to what were becoming the crowded skies above the Red Planet. Mars Global Surveyor, Mars Express and Mars Odyssey were in orbit around Mars, and the Spirit and Opportunity rovers were on the surface. But the MRO has a lot of different tasks, all paving the way for future Mars missions and culminating in a manned landing on the Red Planet in about 15 years. It has been mapping Mars in fine detail, and this information has already been used to select a landing site for the Phoenix lander. The orbiter is also collecting detailed information about the weather patterns on Mars. While it continued to transmit a clearer picture of the planet, back on Earth, a new rover was taking shape. A rover like none before, and one that would work very closely with the MRO. Lockheed Martin, under the supervision of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, was building a rover the size of a small car. Unlike previous rovers, it wouldn't use solar panels for its power. It's equipped with a radioisotope thermoelectric generator with a minimum lifespan of 14 years. Known as Curiosity, the rover has a range of cameras and chemical analysis tools, as well as a robotic arm and radiation detector. Before it could fly, Curiosity had to be tested at extreme temperatures and vibration. Towards the end of 2011, Curiosity, fixed into its entry, descent and landing module, was packed into the nose cone of an Atlas V. Because of the proximity of Mars, the launch window was extremely narrow.
3, 2, 1. Main engine start, 0, and liftoff.
It would take the craft more than 8 months to reach Mars. The Centaur upper stage pushed the craft out of Earth orbit onto a trans-Mars trajectory. Before they separated, the Curiosity package was set rotating for stability. The crew's assembly was equipped with heaters to maintain stable temperatures for critical subsystems that remained dormant during the cruise phase. Solar cells provide power for communication with mission control, and thrusters are used for course corrections.
Things are looking good. Coming up on entry.
As it approached Mars, the team at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory waited. 10 minutes before reaching Mars's atmosphere, the cruise stage was jettisoned, and an incredibly complex sequence of events was about to unfold. As it entered the atmosphere, it was travelling at about 20,000 kilometres per hour, and the first stage of deceleration began. The thrusters kept the craft aligned to the target, selected with the help of the MRO. Signals confirming each stage of the descent were relayed back to JPL via the Mars Odyssey. Next, balance weights were thrown off, so the craft could keep the correct attitude for parachute deployment. Still moving at 1,600 kilometres per hour, the small parachute unfurled, and the heat shield was discarded. From orbit, the MRO captured this image of the descent stage. At 1,500 metres, the descent stage separated from the back shell, and the landing thrusters ignited. A radar altimeter monitored both the craft's height and its speed. At a height of 20 metres and now moving at 3 kilometres per hour, the rover was lowered on cables and the wheels deployed. When it was on firm ground, it fired pyros, severing the cables. The sky crane technique was used so that dust and debris stirred up by the rockets couldn't damage the rover.
Touchdown confirmed. We're safe on Mars.
Most of these JPL people have devoted large parts of their lives to this project. This was the first time such a landing had been attempted, and it had been flawless. Almost immediately, an image was relayed back. Using one of its hazard avoidance cameras, Curiosity had sent an image of the surface, and the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter was playing a vital role as a communications hub. It records signals sent via the rover's UHF transmitter and retransmits them when it can see Earth. Curiosity had been set down near the Gale crater, just south of the Martian equator. Initially, the rover began transmitting detailed information about its system status and its descent and landing experience. During its first days on Mars, the rover's now redundant flight program was dumped and replaced with surface operations software. Its camera mast was extended, and Curiosity began changing completely the way we think about Mars.